Welcome to Punk's Pre-Punk. On today's episode, we're diving into the life of a historical rebel so intense he makes modern rock stars look like amateurs. I'm talking about Benjamin Lay. So today we're going to find out how a 4-foot-tall man living in a cave managed to completely terrify the wealthiest elites of the American colonies. Second, how he successfully engineered the very first anti-slavery ruling in modern human history using nothing but radical DIY theater. And third, how he lived a completely countercultural vegan lifestyle centuries before the word even existed. But near the end of this episode, I'm going to reveal the wild story of how one of America's most famous founding fathers secretly teamed up with this cave-dwelling radical to weaponize his message against the establishment. Mainstream history books have completely left out this partnership, and I think you're going to love it. So stick around until the end to find out who it was and what they did. Think punk started in the 70s? Think again. Welcome to Punk's Pre-Punk, where I show you how the rebel attitude and DIY ethos of punk rock was blazing a trail long before bands like Death or The Damned. I'm your host, Andrew Winter. So, imagine you're sitting in a Quaker meeting house back in 1738. It's in the middle of September, somewhere in New Jersey. If you know anything about old school Quaker meetings, you know that they are dead silent. People just sit there in plain clothes, waiting for the spirit to move them. It's incredibly quiet. Then, the front door basically flies off its hinges. In walks this guy who is barely 4 feet tall. He's got a massive hunchback, a wild white beard, and he's wearing this giant, tattered white overcoat that he obviously made himself. He marches right up to the front of the room, stares down the richest slave-owning guys in the congregation, and whips off his coat. Underneath, he's wearing a military uniform and holding a literal sword. He pulls out a book, screams at everyone that holding people in chains is a sin against God, and drives the sword right into the book. This dark red blood just sprays everywhere, soaking people in the front rows. Women are fainting, people are screaming, it's total chaos. But the blood isn't real. It's just pokeberry juice he squeezed himself, and he'd hollowed out a book to hide a bladder full of its pages. When you look at the social norms of 1738, this wasn't just a loud protest, it was a psychological bomb. Quaker meeting houses back then were governed by absolute silence. There was no music, no planned sermon, just dead, quiet contemplation. On top of that, the entire culture prized decorum, hierarchy, and a strict plainness of dress and speech. And look at who he targeted. He didn't drop this stunt in the back row. He marched right up to the front rows where the wealthiest, most politically powerful merchants and landowners in the colony sat. In colonial society, publicly humiliating upper-class elders was unthinkable. Then you add a literal weapon and spraying blood into a strictly pacifist environment, and it caused pure terror. It was the 18th century equivalent of a shocking punk album cover or full-blown guerrilla performance art. To understand how someone develops that level of uncompromising rage, we have to look at how Benjamin Lay was born a permanent outsider. He entered the world in 1681 in Essex, England, born into a deeply committed Quaker family. But he was also born with a radical form of dwarfism. He maxed out at just over 4 feet tall, with a prominent hunchback and remarkably slender legs. In the 17th century rural England, a highly visible physical debility meant that you were an immediate target. Before modern science, the public viewed different bodies with cruel amusement, suspicion, and straight-up pity. Benjamin was routinely mocked, pointed at, and shut out from normal society. But instead of letting that marginalization crush his spirit, it did something fascinating. It gifted him a radical capacity for empathy. He knew exactly what it felt like to be looked down upon, to be categorized as inherently inferior by a comfortably majority. This personal understanding of social ostracization became his baseline. He knew what it was like to be cast aside by the powerful, and it primed him to spot systematic cruelty where others just saw everyday life. Plus, his family was Quaker, meaning he was steeped in the fiery countercultural theology. Early Quakerism wasn't polite. It was a disruptive movement that fractured English society. They believed in the inner light, the radical idea that God dwells inside every single human being, completely bypassing kings, priests, or wealth. Early Quakers were thrown in jail for refusing to bow to nobility or pay taxes to the state. Lay grew up on these stories, absorbing a worldwide view that taught him human laws mean absolutely nothing if they violate divine justice. As a teenager, he left home to find his own path. His frame made heavy farm work brutal, so he trained as a glover, learning leatherworking. But the walls of a small workshop couldn't hold his energy. He wanted to see the world and escape the rigid social constraints of England. So at a time when life at sea was notoriously violent and punishing, a 4-foot-tall Benjamin Lay decided to become a merchant sailor. Lay lived a nomadic life on the Atlantic Ocean for over 12 years. Life aboard an 18th-century sailing vessel was a test of raw survival, rotten food, violent storms, rampant disease, and brutal corporate discipline from wealthy merchant company. But for Lay, the sea was an equalizer. On a ship, your height mattered way less than your ability to pull your own weight, tie knots, and survive. He hardened his hands, his muscles, and his voice. And it was during these 12 years at sea that Lay's eyes were forced wide open to the global economic engine of his era, the transatlantic slave trade. As a sailor, he didn't just read about slavery. He watched it function on the docks. He saw the slave ships rolling into ports, packed to absolute capacity with human cargo. He watched African men, women, and children dragged off the decks in chains, covered in filth, terrified and bearing horrific physical deformities from weeks of confinement in the dark, suffocating hulls. He learned that you could smell a slave ship before you could even see it on the horizon. He noticed a chilling parallel. The global trade system was systematically deforming and destroying the bodies of black human beings for profit, just as society marginalized and mocked his own non-conforming frame. Yet white sailors and wealthy merchants looked at this industrial-scale misery with total casual indifference. To them, it wasn't a moral horror, it was just trade. It was just the cost of doing business. This exposure planted a seed of profound, unyielding fury in Lay's mind. He looked at the vast wealth flowing into the empire, and he realized the entire civilized world was floating on a river of human blood. Around 1710, Lay returned to dry land in London, where he met the absolute love of his life, Sarah Smith. Sarah was also a committed Quaker, and like Benjamin, she was a little person who lived with a physical disability. The two fell deeply in love, discovering a profound intellectual and spiritual partnership. Sarah was brilliant, sharp-tongued, and shared Benjamin's radical commitment to purity. They married in 1718, packed up their lives, and set sail for the wealthy, booming British colony of Barbados to open a grocery shop, completely unaware that they were walking directly into the gears of an absolute living hell. When Benjamin and Sarah stepped off the boat in Barbados, they entered a world engineered entirely around maximum profit through absolute terror. Barbados wasn't just a standard colony, it was a total sugarocracy. The entire island had been clear-cut to create massive industrial sugar estates. Enslaved Africans made up the overwhelming majority of the population, completely outnumbering the tiny elite of white British plantation owners who lived in a state of constant paranoid terror of a slave rebellion. Because the white elite was so heavily outnumbered, they maintained control through public spectacles of horrific, everyday sadism. Acts of extreme violence weren't hidden away, they were done right in the open to terrorize people into submission. Because Benjamin and Sarah ran a small grocery shop in town, their storefront became a crossroads. Enslaved people sent to run errands would pass by. Many of them were starving, half-naked, and begging for food scraps. While the rest of white society ignored or drove them away with whips, Benjamin and Sarah opened their doors. They brought these suffering people into their shop, fed them, gave them milk, and did something truly revolutionary for 1718. They sat down and talked to them as human equals. They listened to their stories and saw the graphic reality of the sugar fields up close. Lay documented seeing human beings worked until their muscles tore and their bones fractured. In Barbados, the sugar aristocracy operated on a calculated corporate policy of working people to death. Because the slave trade was flowing heavily, bringing in a constant supply of cheap human labor from Africa, plantation owners explicitly calculated that it was more profitable to buy new enslaved people and work them to death within a few short years than it was to spend money providing them food, clothing, and rest required to keep them alive. Every single day, Lay's moral core was systematically pulverized. One of the specific reoccurring horrors that permanently shattered his psyche was the iron cage execution. Plantation owners would take an enslaved person, lock them inside a tight, constricting iron cage, and hoist them into the air from a prominent tree branch over a public road. The person was left hanging there in direct, blistering, humid Caribbean heat with absolutely no food, water, slowly dehydrating and starving to death over several days. White society would walk right past these cages, ignoring the agonizing screams, treating it like mundane backroad noise. The first-hand exposure to absolute horror completely broke Benjamin Lay. It traumatized him to his very core. He looked at the beautiful white sugar that people back home were casually putting into their tea, and he realized it was paid for in literal human flesh. Lay couldn't hold his tongue. He began publicly berating plantation owners on the streets, screaming at them for their cruelty. He stood up in religious meetings and accused them of structural damnation. Very quickly, the white elite realized this eccentric grocer was a dangerous agitator. The threats against Benjamin and Sarah grew loud and violent. Realizing they could no longer survive, the Lays packed up their shop in 1720, completely radicalized, and fled the island. By 1731, they arrived in the place they hoped would be a true holy sanctuary, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was supposed to be the crown jewel of Quaker colonization, founded as a refuge of Christian love and human equality. But the reality beneath the surface was a profound contradiction. The holy sanctuary was completely entangled in the global slave trade. When Lay walked through the streets of Philadelphia, he didn't find a community of pure brotherhood. Instead, he looked at the docks and saw ships unloading enslaved Africans directly onto the riverfront. He looked at the grand brick townhouses of the most respected Quaker elders and ministers, and he discovered that almost all of them owned slaves. The wealth of Philadelphia's Quaker elite was built on a dual hypocrisy. Not only did they exploit enslaved labor within Pennsylvania, but their merchant ships were constantly trading with Barbados. They were shipping grain and lumber down to the Caribbean to feed the plantation owners and shipping molasses, rum, and slave-grown sugar right back up to Philly. The holy experiment was directly subsidizing and profiting from the exact iron cages and work-to-death camps that had traumatized Lay in Barbados. Lay tried playing by the rules at first. He went to the local Quaker business meetings, stood up, and argued using scripture and logic. But the establishment did what comfortable institutions always do when their profits are threatened. They ignored him. They told him to sit down. They told him he was being disruptive, uncivil, and out of order. The wealthy elders argued that slavery was a complex economic necessity, that they were kind masters, and that the church needed to maintain peace and unity rather than fracturing over political issues. Lay saw right through it. He realized that polite conversation and respectability politics are a complete trap. When a system is making people rich, they have a massive financial incentive to remain morally blind. They will intellectually tune out a polite speech every single time. Lay understood that if you want to pierce through a kind of deep, systematic cognitive dissonance, you cannot use polite debate. You have to use shock therapy. You have to weaponize your own body and perform acts of radical, undeniable theater that force people to physically confront their own hidden monsterness. And so the guerrilla stunts began. Benjamin Lay transformed his entire life into a non-stop walking protest. After he splattered the front rows of that New Jersey meeting house with pokeberry juice, the Quaker establishment officially disowned him. They published public notices declaring he was a chaotic exile and banned him from church business meetings. But Lay didn't give a damn about their institutional stamps. Being cast out of polite society gave him total, ultimate freedom. He no longer had a social status to lose, so he went completely all in on his stunts. So, picture this. It's the den of winter in Philadelphia, and a massive freezing blizzard has hit. The snow is feet deep, and the temperatures are dangerously below freezing. A wealthy, prominent Quaker elder who owns multiple slaves rolls up to the local meeting house in a warm, lavish, velvet-lined carriage wrapped in a heavy, expensive fur. But Benjamin Lay is already at the gate. He stands right where the carriage has to stop, takes off his shoe, takes off his sock, and deliberately shoves his bare foot deep into the freezing, icy snowbank. When the wealthy elder steps out of his warm carriage, he looks down, sees this 4-foot-tall man shivering in the snow, and is struck by a wave of casual charity. The rich man tells Lay he's being foolish, that he's gonna freeze to death, and he urges him to go inside and get warm. Lay looks right back into the man's eyes and delivers a calculated rhetorical strike. He said, "You care more about my foot than you do your slaves, whom you force to work in your fields with no shoes or coats at all." In one brilliant physical moment, Lay trapped the man in his own hypocrisy. He forced the elder to voice pity for a white man's cold foot, only to instantly weaponize that pity to expose the elder's absolute blindness toward the black human beings freezing on his property. Or, check this out. Lay observes a neighboring white family who were respected members of the community and owned several slaves. One afternoon, while their young son is playing outside near the roads, Lay quickly approaches him, gathers him up, and brings him back to his own property, keeping him completely safe, warm, and fed inside for a few hours. Back at the neighbor's house, absolute chaos broke out. The parents discovered their child is missing. They are running through the streets, crying, screaming, losing their minds with panic, experiencing the ultimate agonizing terror of every parent, the belief that their child is gone forever. Once the psychological tension reaches its absolute peak, Lay walks down the road holding the boy's hand and is returned to his parents completely unharmed. As the parents clutch their child, crying with relief, Lay stands over them and delivers a devastating emotional mirror. Now you know a fraction of the raw, tearing grief that African parents experience every single day when you buy and sell their children away for them, never to see them again. It was aggressive, it was deeply offensive, and it completely shattered the comfortable, intellectual detachment that allowed white parents to participate in the slave market without a second thought. When the church authorities tried to physically bar him from entering their spaces, they would appoint large, burly guards to physically pick Lay up and hurl him out into the street. Lay didn't fight back. He practiced absolute non-violent resistance. When they threw him into the mud, dirt, or pouring rain, he would simply lie completely flat on his back in the mud, right across the threshold of the doorway. He would refuse to move for hours. When the services ended and the wealthy, well-dressed congregants tried to leave the building, they found themselves completely trapped. Imagine the scene. Lay looking up at them from the mud, telling them that if they wanted to go home, they had to look down and physically step over his body first. He turned his own physical frame into a literal roadblock against their comfort, forcing them to trample a fellow human being if they wanted to return to their normal, polite lives. And finally, picture this. Lay marches right into the center of Philadelphia's busy marketplace during peak hours, carrying a large, heavy blacksmith's hammer. He walks up to a prominent stall and targets a collection of expensive imported china and porcelain tea sets. In the 1730s, these tea sets were the ultimate high society status symbols used by wealthy colonials to host polite tea parties where they drank tea heavily sweetened with sugar harvested from the death camps of the West Indies. Lay takes his hammer and publicly smashes the porcelain to absolute pieces, sending shards flying across the marketplace. The crowd screams in shock while Lay shouts over the noise that this beautiful china and the sweet tea inside are strained with literal blood of enslaved Africans. He was declaring a total, absolute consumer boycott on the entire global capitalist economy. Benjamin Lay understood a fundamental truth that lies at the core of the punk ethos. If you consume what a corrupt system produces, you are keeping that corrupt system alive. You cannot just protest a broken society on the weekends while buying its products during the week. So Lay decided to completely opt out of the 18th century world. He chose absolute, uncompromising DIY self-reliance. Following the death of his beloved Sarah, Lay moved a few miles outside of Philadelphia into the rural town of Abington. He didn't buy a house or rent a property. Instead, he found an actual deep stone cave on a hillside and decided to make it his home. He used his woodworking skills to modify the space, carving bookshelves directly into the natural rock walls to house his massive library of over 200 books. Lay looked at the global textile industry and realized that cotton was picked by enslaved hands, and a major wool was tied up in exploitative merchant systems. So Lay refused to wear it. He grew his own flax right outside his cave. He learned how to spin those raw fibers himself and wove his own rough, tattered, heavy white clothing. He wore his own labor on his back, completely free from the supply chains of human suffering. He also became a strict vegetarian, practically a vegan, at a time when the concept didn't even have a name. He refused to eat anything that required the death of an animal, and he absolutely banned sugar from entering his cave because it was a direct link to the horrors of Barbados. He lived entirely off of milk, water, acorns, nuts, and the vegetables and fruits he cultivated in his own hands. He was showing the world that it was entirely possible to live an intellectual, spiritually profound life without exploiting a single human being or animal. He built his own counterculture inside a stone cave. But he had one final massive artistic strike left to deliver. He wanted to publish a definitive, unpolished manifesto of his philosophy. He spent months writing a frantic, sprawling, chaotic text with a title that reads like an angry underground hardcore punk record. All slave keepers that keep the innocent in bondage apostates. Because the Quaker overseers had officially banned him, no mainstream printer in the colonies would touch a manuscript this radical. And remember that secret founding father partnership I teased at the top of the episode? This is where it happens. Lay took his pages to a young, independent, iconoclastic printer in Philadelphia who didn't give a damn about the church authorities. His name was Benjamin Franklin. Franklin loved Lay's eccentric rebel spirit. He took the job and printed the book. Because Lay was not a formally trained academic and refused to let editors polish his thoughts, the book reads exactly like a raw, unfiltered stream of consciousness tirade. It jumps wildly from screaming denunciation to biblical prophecy to personal memoirs of Barbados. It is pure, unpolished, high-velocity energy. The moment it hit the streets, the authorities officially condemned it. But the match had been struck. The ideas were out in the open. Benjamin Lay lived in his cave for decades, aging into a wild-looking prophet with a massive flowing white beard, walking with a cane, still wearing his homemade flax clothes, and permanently labeled a lunatic and a freak by mainstream colonial society. But the continuous, shocking pressure he applied for 30 years began to slowly crack the foundations of the institution. Young Quakers who grew up watching Lay lie in the mud outside their meetings or saw him splatter pokeberry juice on their parents couldn't shake the imagery. Radical thinkers took up the mantle, carrying Lay's uncompromising message into the main body of the church. Lay had broken the ground with a sledgehammer so that others could plant the seeds. In 1758, Benjamin Lay was 77 years old, his body frail and failing, resting in his bed. A close friend rushed to his cave to deliver a piece of monumental news. The Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, the very body that had disowned him, mocked him, and thrown him into the dirt for decades, had just held an official vote. They had officially decreed that any Quaker who continued to buy, sell, or import enslaved human beings would be completely expelled from the church. The institution had finally broken. They had passed the very first anti-slavery ruling in the history of the modern world. When the old rebel heard the news, he sat up in his bed. The rage that had sustained him for 40 years had finally gave way to a wave of profound relief. He looked at his friend and exclaimed, "Thanksgiving and praise be rendered unto the Lord God, I can now die in peace." He passed away just a few months later in 1759. He didn't live to see the total legal abolition of slavery across the world, but he lived long enough to see the very first stone fall out of the wall. He had proven that one solitary person standing up completely alone, refusing to play nice, can shift the moral axis of an entire civilization. Benjamin Lay didn't have an electric guitar, a leather jacket, or a bright pink mohawk, but he possessed the absolute pure essence of what defines true punk rock, a total refusal to accept a broken status quo. The courage to stand up completely alone while an entire society calls you crazy, and the unwillingness to make an absolute terrifying scene on behalf of the underdog. He looked at a multi-million-dollar global economic engine and said, "I will build my own with my own hands inside a cave before I allow my life to profit off someone else's pain." Next time you feel like the world is too massive, too corrupt, or too broken to fight, just think about this 4-foot-tall guy in a homemade coat, standing in a blizzard with a bare foot, demanding justice from a world that wasn't ready for it. Now, if you want to dive deeper into the gritty, unfiltered history of early American radicalism, the books I relied on for this episode, including foundational biographies on Lay and deep dives into the early Quaker movement, are listed in the show notes. Go check them out. Thanks for listening to the very first episode of Punk's Pre-Punk. If this story lit a little bit of that rebel fire in your chest today, do all the usual podcast stuff. Please hit subscribe, leave a review, and share this track with someone who needs a reminder that the status quo is meant to be broken. On our next episode, we're going to be leaving the caves of Pennsylvania behind and heading deep into the churches of the American South to talk about Sister Rosetta Tharpe, a queer black woman who literally invented the heavy, distorted rock and roll guitar style that changed the universe, while a conservative establishment tried to erase her name from the credits. Until next time, keep smashing the porcelain and keep rocking the boat.